Inspired by true events, two entrepreneurs came up with a brilliant business concept in the 1960s to battle for housing integration and equitable access to the American dream. It is 1954, and Bernard Garrett, an African-American entrepreneur, is looking to invest in real estate. He tries his luck in purchasing houses in white neighborhoods and is met with relentless racism, which ultimately keeps him from being a successful real estate investor. Eventually, Bernard catches sight of a reasonably priced property and gets in touch with Patrick Barker, a real estate investor responsible for it. While heckling on the price of the property, Bernard asks for a $10,000 investment from Patrick, who refuses despite admiring Bernard's entrepreneurial gusto. During the unfavorable conversation, Bernard catches sight of a calendar in Patrick's office. The calendar is from Edward Reed, a bank employee and a friend of Patrick's. Filled with resolve, Bernard thanks Patrick for his time and leaves the office. He then pays a visit to the bank where Mr. Reed works at and directly requests a loan from him, giving Patrick's reference. The same night, he receives a call from Mr. Barker. Patrick informs Bernard that Mr. Reed has agreed to sign off on his loan, and Patrick has agreed to act as guarantor. Bernard is astonished. He immediately agrees to the loan, having gained Patrick's good faith. That night, Bernard and his wife Eunice go out to celebrate, where they meet Joe Morris, the owner of a wealthy club. Bernard had met Joe by chance, and the two had gotten along on the wrong foot. Joe pulls Bernard aside for a chat and tells him that he invests in people he sees potential, and Joe sees great potential in Bernard. Still skeptical, Bernard brushes the conversation off. Having secured the loan for repairs on his newly purchased property, Bernard meets and hires Matt Steiner, a home repair worker. After agreeing on hourly wages, they begin working on undue repairs on the property, with Bernard putting up with racist comments and undue suspicion from the building residents and the police. However, the revamped property immediately attracts tenants, and Bernard prioritizes renting it to the people of color. Bernard is successful in fully leasing the property as per his deal with Patrick, who invites him into a 50-50 partnership on a real estate investment deal. Bernard readily agrees, and he and Patrick successfully purchase and lease multiple properties all over Los Angeles. Bernard is even able to buy a beautiful home for his family. But this temporary bliss soon comes to an end when one fateful morning, Patrick Barker passes away. Patrick's wife moves to end the 50-50 partnership with Bernard on the grounds of poorly masked racism. Despite Bernard owning 50% of the dozen properties he purchased alongside Patrick, she offers him an outrageously low price. Due to not having his name on any of the deeds, and knowing full well that neither Patrick's lawyer nor his banker Mr. Reed would come to his aid, Bernard has no choice but to accept the offer. With a considerable loss of business, Bernard turns to Joe Morris. After analyzing his impressive track record, Bernard convinces Joe to be his co-investor. Bernard proposes his idea to buy one of the tallest commercial buildings in the city, housing several banks. Bernard proposes to make it easier for people of color to secure loans from banks, after having struggled himself in the same regard. However, the two entrepreneurs are aware of the inevitable racial struggle they will face in securing this massive purchase. Hence they turn to Matt Steiner to be the face of their venture. They convince Matt to be the favorable white man to pose in company meetings to facilitate sales. From playing exceptional golf to having a tasteful wardrobe and fluently verbalizing account stats, Matt is groomed by Bernard and Joe to appear as a well-versed real estate investor. After a very successful negotiation, the trio purchase the banker's building and immediately get to work to secure several properties around Los Angeles. They effectively integrate several previously segregated neighborhoods by selling and renting specifically to black families. Cut to a few years after massive success in Los Angeles, Bernard pays a visit to his father in Texas, where he grew up. He realizes that even after all these years, little has changed in his hometown regarding racial inclusivity and equality. During a conversation with his father, he comes to the resolve to buy the local bank in his hometown to make it easier for black people to secure loans. Bernard proposes his idea to Joe, who is reluctant. Texas is more rigid in upholding white supremacy than Los Angeles. The only people of color allowed inside the bank premises are the maintenance staff. However, despite Joe's reservations, Bernard is adamant, and eventually, Joe relents. The trio moves to Texas to proceed with the purchase. During the meeting to confirm the purchase of Mainland Bank, Texas, the bank owner's son Robert Florence Jr. is suspicious about the absence of Bernard and Joe. Well aware of the residents' mindset, Bernard is 2 steps ahead, informing his community members of the bank purchase to identify potential borrowers and cautioning them to keep this policy discreet. Bernard's vision to foster business growth and home ownership begins to take shape. Meanwhile, Florence's suspicion deepens, and he confronts Matt for the approval of 14 loans in 1 week. Considering the bank's poor loaning history, Florence is curious about the loan applicants. Matt attempts to minimize the suspicion by assuring Florence that more loans bring more profit for the bank, which is good for both of them in the long run. However, Florence is not convinced and follows Matt and photographs him speaking to Bernard at a restaurant. He confronts the trio in Bernard's house, convinced that they are committing fraud, and threatens to lift the veil of secrecy Bernard and Joe have on. Florence is agitated by the idea of two blacks owning his father's bank, and cannot believe that his father knew about this arrangement before the confirmation of the deal. He vocalizes his concern about losing his 20% share in the business, claiming that the people of Texas would be angered if they found out that their bank was loaning to and owned by black people. Bernard and Joe lay out the facts for him, informing him that they are working as per the law. However, Florence informs them that their unusual number of approved loans has attracted the U.S. Treasury Department, and the comptroller of the currency has moved up the bank's yearly inspection by 2 quarters. Word has it that the bank is making unsafe loans, which spells trouble for the trio. Matt views this information as an opportunity and proposes to Joe and Bernard that they buy another bank. They settle on the Bank of Marlin, a very small bank whose ownership will be assumed by. Matt's idea is to move all the loans from Mainland to Marlin before Mainland gets inspected, ensuring that the government stays out of their business. Joe and Bernard find it to be an interesting proposition but disagree with Matt on giving him ownership of the bank. Having experience of mere 3 months, they are not confident that Matt is up for the job. Matt is adamant and informs them that he will resign if they do not approve his ownership. Reluctantly, Joe and Bernard agree. With business running smoothly, Matt updates Bernard and Joe about his pending approval on a new packet of loans. Bernard cautions him to go through the documentation thoroughly and not miss out on discrepancies in the numbers. Matt approves the due loans with his signature, and not long after that, he is contacted by a federal examiner from the comptroller of the currency department for an inspection. Matt panics and dials up Bernard on his telephone, who is helplessly thinking about how Matt would inevitably get into trouble. Eventually, convinced by Eunice, Bernard puts on a janitor's uniform and heads over to Marlin to save Matt from the federal officer's wrath. There are apparent discrepancies in the master books, and despite Bernard's futile attempts to tip Matt on what to say, Matt is confused and disoriented in front of the federal officer. He is unable to answer questions regarding the approval of faulty individual loans. He excuses himself and meets with Joe and Bernard in the bank restroom. Bernard immediately locates the said discrepancies in the documentation and is confused, considering that he went through the loans himself. He inquires if Matt met with his trusted lawyer to go over the documentation before he signed off on it, and Matt confesses that he did not. Florence introduced him to a lawyer who reviewed the document, and Matt, being unfamiliar with all the dynamics of banking, signed the checks without questioning anything. Joe and Bernard are in shock that Matt would trust Florence. They bring Florence's true intentions to gain leverage over ownership of Mainland in front of Matt, and prepare for the inevitable shutdown of the Bank of Marlin. The trio assesses the stakes of letting Marlin close, and resolves to move their attention back to Mainland. Joe and Bernard ask Matt to focus on the business in Mainland, and to keep a close eye on Florence. This advice goes in vain when Joe gets a call from his banker informing him that Mainland is buying the faulty loans from Marlin for face value. Joe and Bernard immediately confront Matt for this error, but are interrupted by federal officers from the U.S. Treasury Department. Matt is immediately fired, the bank is shut down, and Joe and Bernard are arrested. Both Joe and Bernard are faced with federal charges, and must come up with a strategy to get said charges revoked. Meanwhile, Matt potentially faces 50 years in prison and is counseled by law officials on what should be done next. He is given 2 options: to be honest in his testimony and admit that he pretended to be a professional in his field of business, or confess that Joe and Bernard forced him to dupe bank customer, and sign off on the faulty loans and be granted immunity. In court, Matt takes the plea deal, falsely testifying that Bernard and Joe duped him. The 2 display looks of betrayal, as Matt potentially minimizes their chances of having the federal charges against them dropped. Shortly after, Bernard meets with his lawyer to discuss his strategy. Like Matt, Bernard is given 2 options: either to take the immunity deal by admitting whatever Matt said in court was true, and let Congress fill the gaps in banking laws, or to say whatever he wants in court and let the rampant racial discrimination in society do its part. Bernard's values are put on a pedestal after the conversation with the law officials. He is not one to cower behind lies. Ultimately, in court, Bernard passionately brings to light the American values of equality and protection of the rights of all citizens. He highlights the faults in American law, where court hearings are disguised as sessions to uncover and reform unsafe banking practices, when in reality, they are simply a different form of racial discrimination. Bernard pulls out the janitor uniform he initially wore inside the bank premises, and introduces it to the court as the dress code for people of color. He exposes the economic structure actively working against black people, where they struggle to get loans, own homes or businesses, and ultimately cannot build wealth, effectively being excluded from the American dream. As a consequence of his outburst, Bernard and Joe see their fortunes completely destroyed when the federal government seizes their assets. The 2 receive a 3-year sentence after being found guilty of stealing bank funds. Only one of the 177 buildings the 2 possess remains in Eunice's name because the deed is in her name. The mainland bank is likewise gone, having been bought by Florence for a little portion of what Bernard and Joe had originally spent in its purchase. After serving his sentence, Bernard walks out of prison to meet his wife and friend waiting for him by the car. He embraces his wife and suggests that they all go home. Upon Eunice's confusion, Bernard tells her about his arrangement with Matt before their court hearing. Matt had called Bernard and told him about facing 50 years in prison. Knowing well that he would not win the case, Bernard had told Matt to do what he thought best and asked him for a favor. Bernard knew that all his properties would be seized, so he entrusted Matt with his money and asked Matt to buy 2 homes for him and Joe in the Bahamas. Bernard and Joe begin to build their fortunes in the Bahamas before moving to the United States. The hundreds of properties they had initially purchased became instrumental in the fight against house segregation in Los Angeles. 3 years after their testimony, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which makes it illegal to refuse to sell or rent property based on race, religion, and gender.